Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminlology podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Professor Paul Ekblom. Professor Paul Ekblom is professor in crime science and design in the UK. He is passionate about the quality of thinking, communication and knowledge in crime prevention, security and community safety. This applies equally, but in different ways, to practice, programs and policy, and to research, theorising and evaluation within and across the disciplines of crime science, design and engineering in material and cyberspace. This interview was conducted on the 24th of May 2024.
Welcome, Paul Ekblom, to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminlology podcast. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Very pleased to be here.
Welcome, Paul Ekblom, and we are very pleased to have you here because it's an opportunity to talk about something very interesting. Not only usually we talk about criminology, but we want to take the opportunity to talk about both criminology and crime science, as this is your specialization. Could you elaborate on the differences between criminology and crime science, according to you?
Okay, well, criminology is extremely wide in terms of covering everything from how people grow up to be offenders and have criminal careers to the workings of the police, courts, prisons, and so on. It also applies perspectives such as social structural perspectives on why crime exists and so on and so forth. At one extreme, it kind of becomes cultural and interpretive rather than empirical and theoretical in a hard sense. Crime science is a bit like medical science in that it's done in support of a very practical purpose. It aims to understand crime with a particular focus on criminal events rather than so much who is doing it and why. And it goes into the immediate causes of criminal events in order to develop the best possible, ideally evidence-based means of interrupting those causes so the events are less likely to happen or less harmful. Ultimately, it's about practical crime reduction. And in terms of how it operates, I mean, there's a lot of psychology in there rather than sociology, though it's not at all 100%. It tries to draw on the methods and concepts of a whole range of sciences, with a particular focus on causal mechanisms operating at the individual event level or before the event or sometimes after the event. It it tries to draw in the insights from a range of different scientific approaches. I mean, on the one hand, it's interested in the content of what other science has produced, such as materials science for target hardening of places and products and so on. The science of sensors in order to improve surveillance. Obviously, psychological science in terms of what influences criminals and other people's perceptions and decision making. The geography of maps and physical networks, computer science, obviously with massive development in cybercrime and how that relates to the completely different set of constraints imposed upon people by cyberspace, or should I say the lack of constraints. So I think that's a broad idea of crime science. As I say, very practical, but using drawing on scientific content from different disciplines, but also trying to use the methods of science, theories, mechanisms, scientific realism, and so on.
Where would you place the origins of crime sciences?
Well, I suppose to give perhaps an extreme example, one could go back to even people like Cesare Lombroso. He got an awful lot wrong trying to identify causes of criminality in terms of bumps on people's heads and so on and so forth. But he was trying to construct a logical series of causes. I suppose historically, where crime science started out was in moves towards environmental criminology, which saw a pretty big shift from sociological and anthropological perspectives, the 1920s, 30s, and so on, to situational approaches, where crime is understood in terms of what the offender sees in the environment, the opportunities, the risk, the effort and reward of committing crime, and how we can actually start to influence the likelihood and the harm of criminal events by altering these things. So the rise of opportunity approaches, situational prevention and problem-oriented approaches, they were kind of existing in a rather loose network. And then about the late 90s, we've got people like Professor Ken Pease and the UK crime broadcaster Nick Ross, who started saying, let's pull this together and give it a clear scientific focus, try to organise all these perspectives into a common point of view and a common approach. And I think it was Nick Ross started calling it crime science, and the phrase has stuck. And people have, in various institutions, have started using it. The lead was the Jill Dando Institute at University College London, which was named after Nick Ross's fellow crime broadcaster, who was sadly murdered, and he organised a memorial fund for her, which collected several £1 million, and it was used to establish the Jill Dander Institute at UCL, which then kind of it's got two elements to it. One is the wider Jill Dander Institute, and the other is within that it's the Department of Security and Crime Science, where they now even have undergraduate degrees in crime science, as well as master's degrees and well-developed PhD program. We've seen crime science expand. I mean, in the English-speaking world, it's got pretty strong in Australia. The situational and environmental criminology people in the USA have been developing it, for example, at Rutgers University, Temple University, University of Texas, and so on. It's still rather dwarfed in America, I would say, particularly by conventional criminology. We also have it in places like the Netherlands, at, if I've got the acronym right, the NCTR, or whatever it is, University of Twente, and so on. So it is steadily growing, hopefully not at the expense of conventional criminology, because we really need both sets of perspectives. But at the beginning, crime science felt it was, and situational crime prevention as well, felt it was just a few isolated researchers and practitioners who were surrounded by a world of conventional criminology, and found it very hard to influence people. So they kind of formed a bit of an isolated, almost incestuous group, which made sense at the time, but I think now the time has come for wider links to be made between the two kinds of approach. And yes, I think that's more or less brought us up to date.
Yeah. If I try to put this in context, according to the narrative of the development of criminology that I learned, which is particular, of course, so I'm influenced, of course, when I mention this, because my mentor was Martin Kilias, and Martin Kilias, when he had just finished his studies, he met Leslie Wilkins in Albany, New York. And so according to this view, the origins, I mean, you mentioned the consolidation or the formalization of crime science in the 90s, but perhaps we could place the origins of this different approach to crime in the works of Leslie Wilkins when he joined the Home Office, because I have the impression that he's often forgotten.
Yes, I would agree there. I mean, Leslie Wilkins was an operations researcher in the Second World War, and he brought that approach to Home Office research when the Home Office Research Unit was started in about 1957. And that tradition has actually, it continued the whole realm of administrative criminology, where, you know, for example, they were looking at how to run the prison system more efficiently, or you know, how to manage police patrolling, or topics like that. And in crime science, I would say the Wilkins tradition has continued, most particularly with the problem-oriented policing approach, identifying problems out there, crime problems, not administrative problems, and how to deal with them by the best and more recently the most evidence. I think it continues now. Crime science is connecting more with what you could call conventional security done by security managers, computer security, and so on. So yes, Leslie Wilkins and his spirit definitely live on, and I'm glad to acknowledge that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and then another question that always haunts me is crime science and the situational approaches in general are not very well received by, let's say, what is now mainstream criminology. I always find my position is, of course, very close to the situational approaches, but it's difficult for the mainstream criminology to accept it. I've been working on this idea that you see, the ethos of criminology is a progressive ethos. That men and women are changing constantly, and the society is changing constantly. And so when you come with a solution that doesn't change society or doesn't change the human being, then it's not seen as progressive. And this is how I think sometimes they are so attacked because they are quite effective. When we discussed with Jan van Dijk, you mentioned the Netherlands, he said we were very successful with these approaches, but in the academia, it's still fighting.
Yes, the situational approach hasn't really had a kind of moral narrative. You know, we're not particularly interested in condemning criminals, merely understanding how we can frustrate their goals. So in that respect, it's a bit cold. It particularly where it focuses on causes rather than goals and intentions and so on. There's also, I mean, historically, a lot of crime scientists have come out of psychology, whereas many conventional criminologists have got a sociological background, as I said. I mean, it's quite curious. The psychology department of University College London, first of all, produced Ken Pease, then it produced Gloria Laycock, who again was one of my bosses who worked in the Home Office and then founded was a founder director of the Jill Dando Institute. And then 2 or 3 years later, I did psychology at UCL. And at that stage, I had no idea I was going to go into criminology. I did my PhD thesis on cognitive dissonance theory, which was very, very kind of abstract. But it led me, I mean, even then I was interested in conceptual frameworks and definitions and so on. Perhaps that's something we could get onto later. But I mean, thinking more about there is a cultural divide and between criminology and crime science, I think I mean, Ron Clark, obviously one of the main founders of situational crime prevention, said things like, it's really difficult to see how we can make parents love their children and bring their children up better, whereas, you know, we can put a bolt on a door or something like that. So I would agree in that respect, it's not progressive. But if you look a bit deeper into it, if you can say, let's deal with something like theft from cars, that was regarded as a sort of gateway crime to criminal careers. Something that was easy to do, and it might well get you into trouble with the police, that would spoil your legitimate employment prospects and so on. And that would lead you perhaps into a deeper criminal career. So in that respect, stopping those easy opportunities and easy temptations does have a potentially progressive dimension to it. But it's not so explicit, and it's not tied in with a sort of clear value system. We want to make society fairer. But it still does want to make society better. It wants to reduce harm. But this kind of symbolic social justice side of things, it leaves aside, which is not to say that that shouldn't be done. Merely that it's perhaps somebody else's job. There's room enough for multiple addresses to the problems here.
Yeah, I fully agree, because criminology by definition is multidisciplinary, and maybe there was an over focus on the idea that we can tackle all root causes, but I mean this is obviously impossible, because people over focus, especially from a sociological point of view, on all these risk factors, and especially the role of poverty, which has been discussed a lot. I think also of the work of Rob Sampson, who says we need to look beyond poverty, for example. So every act is the combination, the intersection of person and environment. So I think nowadays times are much more interesting for a joint, initiative of studying crime from a both situational and sociological, if you want, perspective. I also thought it was very interesting what you said about if you try to avoid people starting a criminal trajectory, then you are actually also doing, in the long run, some kind of social prevention, because if you avoid people getting into contact with hardcore criminals or doing acts which leads them to or sets them on a trajectory which leads to a long, not adolescent limited, but life course persistent trajectory, then you're actually doing both the situational and, in the long run, also some social prevention. People maybe don't see this.
Yeah, I would agree. You mentioned root causes. I'm not sure how one actually defines root causes. Certainly from the perspective of a criminal event, where a whole lot of different causes come together. I remember in the Home Office from time to time, there was a sort of fashion for going back to root causes, and it was generally, some new administrator or some minister would come in, just with that idea in their heads. I think the important thing is to cover causes at lots of different levels, from the micro to the macro, from the proximal in the immediate crime situation right through to the distal, such as children's early upbringing or structural inequalities in society and so on. There's one person who's been developing a really good framework for articulating that, and that's Noemi Bilhana at University College London. She's talking about the moral ecology of crime on 5 different levels, starting with criminal propensity, going up through criminal settings, and the immediate group in which people relate, and then right up to social structure. And it's incredibly important that when we're navigating through how to understand crime and what to do about it, that we keep these ecological levels really clear in our heads. Even within situational crime prevention, this isn't clarified very well, because Well, for example, the rational choice approach it's a kind of blend of offender psychology and an economic discourse. Routine activities, basically it started out as a macro sociological perspective, and then it was translated into the microecology of situations. So basically, we have a lot of different perspectives which haven't properly been brought together. And that's one of my interests is in trying to do so.
Yeah, that would be much needed, I think, and an overall view that would be very welcome. You mentioned this idea of constructing frameworks, and of course, you are one of the leaders on this. Perhaps we could dive into this topic.
Yes, I think right from my PhD thesis on dear old cognitive dissonance theory, I tried to rewrite the theory and to connect it up with all the other theories of cognitive and social consistency that were around at the time in a sort of more inclusive and abstract model. For reasons of it was the 1973 oil crisis, I moved away into a career in practical crime prevention after that. So I didn't take that forward, but I've always come back to trying to bring together theoretical approaches and theory and practice. I suppose my first effort with that was the conjunction of criminal opportunity, and this really started when I had, in some respects, the misfortune to be made responsible when I was in the Home Office for evaluating this huge Safer Cities program, which the Home Office introduced in the it's about late 80s, and I was told, right, you're going to be in charge of evaluating. This was after a colleague of mine actually left the Home Office and dumped the task onto me. And there are a few moments where I sort of had to take several big deep breaths. The Safer Cities program was unbelievably wide-ranging. There were 20 cities, each with a Home Office funded coordinator and a small team, who would bid for central money to fund crime prevention projects. And basically they could do anything. So we had conventional street lighting projects, target hardening, to sort of extreme cases such as driving a crime prevention bus around the city to deliver awareness of security messages, to all-women taxi services, to I think my favourite was a crime prevention puppet show. And I thought, how the hell am I going to get to grips with the extreme variety in this? Because measuring the impact of all this scattered across lots of different areas, 20 cities, with all the background changes that were going on in the cities, was challenging, to say the least. And about this time, Nick Tilley came on the scene in the Home Office with his and Ray Paulson's concept of applying the scientific realist approach to crime prevention. where you have to think really hard about the causal mechanisms triggered by your preventive interventions. How exactly are they conjectured to work? How do they have their influence on the offender? How do they have their influence on victims and other players in the crime situation, and so on? And I took that and thought, aha, we can actually start to classify all these different, wildly different crime prevention projects in terms of the possible crime prevention mechanisms. So the Safer Cities programme had quite a large management information system which described all these projects. In many cases, not very clearly. They weren't articulated very well. And I started trying to work out this classification system of about 700 different projects. How did they work? What were their mechanisms? How were they implemented? Who implemented them, and so on? And gradually, I started finding repeating patterns. And I was drawing on a lot of what would eventually become crime science theory, routine activities, rational choice, geography of crime, and so on. But a lot of the crime prevention projects were offender-oriented or community-based, so I couldn't just stick with the situational perspectives. So I went right round the clock from the offender-oriented side round to the situational side. And I managed to come up with just 11 generic intervention principles, starting with the offender's predisposition to commit crime, working all the way around to the situation and who or what was in the situation. And this gradually fell into place. It was a big learning process on my part, because I and a sort of intern were going through all these projects and saying, how does this one fit? Do these fit into the schema that I've developed so far? If they did, then fine. If not, I have to adjust the schema. And so it was an iterative process. I don't know whether, if you have a Swiss background, then I was, in a sense, following the adaptive learning perspective of Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, who talks about assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation is about how, or originally the developing child, or in my case, the developing crime framework. Assimilation is about how you fit new things into an existing framework. Accommodation is about how you have to adjust your framework to fit with things out there which don't actually work in your framework. They don't fit. So how do you adjust the framework? To take a very simple example, one of the 25 techniques of situational crime prevention is target hardening. Obviously making doors and windows and cars and things resistant to being broken into, for example. I came across the design of a lock, a padlock, which you put on the door of a garage or something like that. Most padlocks, they have a sort of hoop where it passes through the fittings on the door. The hoop is rigid, and so if you have a saw, you can saw your way through the hoop. But there's a certain design of padlock where you have a straight shaft which goes through the fitting on the door, and it spins round in its housing. So when you try and saw it, it just spins and you can't cut it. Now, is that target hardening or is it target softening? So the dilemma for the 25 techniques is, do you just assimilate it within target hardening, or do you add a new category? Do you accommodate the framework to target softening and make it 26 techniques? I mean, there's no hard and fast rule, but the point is, when you're developing a framework, the framework has to be a learning engine. In other words, you have to keep updating it. Eventually, after we did about 700 of these crime prevention projects, it started to stabilize, and there weren't. It was a very rare event for me to have to change things, but I think for all my frameworks, I've designed them ever since to remain as learning engines, so that they're not fixed and rigid for all time. We might still come across some new crime method or crime prevention method or something which doesn't fit, or some new contextual factor. So they're all adaptable and adjustable, and it's really important to keep them up to date. I mean, I maintain lists of updates, and sometimes I get round to putting them in. So that's the kind of framework approach that I've developed.
So 700. You realize that in some countries there's no evaluation like that, and you conducted 700.
Well, the evaluation in the Safer Cities program then was done at several levels. My responsibility was for the program as a whole, and the individual project or team managers in each of the cities were supposed to do at least a minimal evaluation of each project or scheme. And in the middle, Nick Tilley came in and did some sample evaluations of, say, car crime projects or something like that at the individual level. But my approach was on a sort of industrial scale, looking at large numbers of, well, the main focus was on burglary projects. Several hundred burglary reduction projects. Some of them were just in very micro areas. Some of them were over a big part of the city. Some of them were over the city as a whole. And trying to devise methodology to handle all that when in advance you didn't know where all the action was going to be was pretty challenging. But I mean, that's another story. But I mean, it's kind of gratifying that the output from the big Safer Cities burglary evaluation was that yes, burglary reduction seemed to work, and it not only had it had a sort of twofold effect. One was a kind of dose-response relationship, where the more money you put in, or more action you put in per household at risk of victimization, the stronger the effect. But there was also, if you think in graphical terms, there was also a big intercept in that the mere presence of burglary action was enough to give a reduction. Anyway, this was all quantified using a geographical information system and multi-level modeling. We were able to come up with an estimate of the cost to prevent the given burglary through Safer Cities type action, and different subtypes of action. And then after the Safer Cities program, few years later, when the Labour government came in, we had the National Crime Reduction Programme. And that started off with a big conference at the Holiday Inn Heathrow Airport, where the Home Office brought in a whole load of people like Larry Sherman, Jan van Dijk, I think, and others, looking at the existing evidence base. And the Labour government in all departments was saying, we're not going to spend any more than the Conservatives' budget, but we're going to spend it in a more intelligent and evidence-based way. So we summarised the evidence, and I'm pleased to say that the Safer Cities evaluation was drawn on quite heavily in terms of the design of the, at least the burglary elements of the National Crime Reduction Programme.
What is the year, more or less, approximately, of this conference?
Oh, that was about 1997. An extremely weird experience because when you go to an airport, you normally expect to go somewhere. And we were stuck in this very corporate hotel going absolutely nowhere, except conceptually, of course. We went on. But so the crime reduction program was good in that it drew on the evidence base in a way which was rather new. And the intention was to develop evaluation and spend something like 10% of the project work on further evaluation, so the knowledge base was developed further. And that worked well for a couple of years, and then there was a change of Home Secretary, and you know how these things drift. A new minister came in who wasn't very hot on evaluation, and we had one of the ministers in our Treasury, our Finance Ministry, say, we've got some spare money in our capital modernisation fund. Say that today. We've got some spare money. How can we spend it? Oh no, we can spend it on CCTV to cut crime. And the officials in the Treasury said, look, Minister, there's no real hard evidence at this point that this is effective or cost effective. But the minister insisted, we know it works, don't we? And then it was passed down to the Home Office, and the Home Office officials said, oh, well, there's no evidence yet. This was before some of the systematic review that David Farrington and forgot his first name, Welsh.
Welsh, exactly.
Undertook, but so you had the really strange spectacle of an operational department, the Home Office, actually resisting money that the Treasury, who are normally very, very close with their money, was trying to ram down its throat. So anyway, we got the CCTV program. Despite the limited evidence, we did manage to insist that there was a lot of evaluation undertaken prospectively of the CCTV program. So we did get something out of it. But the culture of hard evaluation, you think you've nailed it, with the ministers and officials and so on, but it comes and it goes very sadly. You can't rely on it being there all the time. And I think we're going through a pretty thin period now.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, evaluation is always very difficult because you have the process on the product evaluation, the impact evaluation. But I have the impression that also in continental Europe, people, I mean, depending on the kind of prevention we're talking about, are really reluctant to invest in the evaluation because people are afraid that negative results will be used against a project or as an idea to say it doesn't work, so let's get rid of it, especially if a project doesn't work, like some kind of social preventive project. If it doesn't pay off immediately, there's this tension. And
yeah, I mean, there is always a timescale issue in that ministers and officials want the result within a year. When, and particularly on the social and offender-oriented side, it could take 5 or 10 years to show any kind of effect. But the way to cope with that, I mean, some of these insights are now being incorporated into the European Crime Prevention Network has got a big strategy on evaluation, and I'm pleased to say that despite the unfortunate episode of Brexit, I'm still able to contribute there. That you can do things like developing a really strong logic model of how your intervention is supposed to work. This comes back to causal mechanisms again, causal mechanisms and or risk factors. And if you've got a logic model worked out, you can then develop intermediate outcome indicators, which can reveal much earlier whether there are indications of you being on the right track. I mean, we did this with a anti-bicycle theft project at Central St Martin's College of Art and Design, where we developed some bicycle stands which were intended to make it difficult for offenders. It was an M shape stand which forced the cyclist to lock the bike at both ends, rather than the conventional up and over stands where people would just lock the bike in the middle and you could twist the bike and use the bike as a tool to break the lock. Anyway, we didn't have enough funds to do a proper evaluation of the ultimate outcome. Are there fewer bikes being stolen because of these locks? But what we did do, we done some research which showed that these designs actually led to people locking bikes in a way which we already knew was more secure. So we were at least able to point to that intermediate outcome indicator that this was likely in future to give a successful outcome. I mean, it would have been nice to have followed it up, but follow-up evaluations are unbelievably rare in crime prevention. There's only one example I can think of immediately, which was done by Professor Rachel Armitage, the University of Huddersfield. Back in about 2000, she did an impact evaluation of the British police scheme Secured by Design, which encouraged the building or retrofitting of houses with greater physical security. And she showed that after, I think it was a 2-year post-implementation period, that burglary was significantly down and it was cost effective. Anyway, she went back about 10 years after the implementation and again showed that there was still a marked reduction in crime risk in these places. But that was a rare exception. So, which, I mean, we're still left with the issue of what to do about negative results. I mean, prospectively, we have to teach practitioners and policymakers and convince them that any evaluation you do is a kind of risk. It's a gamble on the future. Crime and crime prevention are complex, uncertain. There are all sorts of things changing, so there's no guarantee that anything will work, or even some well-attested type of intervention will work in this particular context. So we have to be adult about taking on risks of intervening preventively. If the intervention has been done in an intelligent way, it's drawn on evidence of what works, it's matched to the crime problem in that area and context, and it's been carefully implemented, and it still doesn't work, then there should be no opprobrium attached to the fact that it's failed. It should be, that was a good effort. What can we learn from failure? A deep investigation of failures is really, really important, rather than trying to sort of hide them away and say, whoops, sorry, we didn't do our job properly.
You mentioned how to teach policymakers the importance of evaluation. And as I said before we started recording, I'm on scientific leave this semester. I'm in Argentina writing a book. And the day before yesterday, I was at the Congress in this discussion about a law on organized crime. So one of my points, I only had 10 minutes, was the need for an evaluation of efficiency and efficacy, because this is a law, and these guys are lawyers. Most of them are lawyers, so they are not already thinking in practical applications of how this law will be operationalized, but at least how to measure the efficiency of a law. And this is quite difficult. Of course, I made my point, but I don't know what is going to happen. So I'm sure you have been thinking about how to teach this, and this should be taught even at the highest levels, at the level of the legislators. What would you propose?
The problem is, once a minister gets into their job, it's too late, because there's so much coming across their desk, and they have to toe the party line, and there are pressures from the mass media, always willing them to simplify, and broadcasters will ask them stupid questions, not taking the subtleties of the situation into account. So you have to get them before they get into their jobs, and I would think, there's in terms of France, where they have the École Nationale d'Administration or something like that, there's a big opportunity there to teach both ministers and officials, potential MPs and what have you. We do have things like the Civil Service College in the UK, but there's nothing that actually briefs ministers in any deep way before they take their job, or even when they're an MP. You will get some MPs very willing to self-educate. For example, there are all-party parliamentary groups on, say, organised crime or violence or something like that, and they will educate themselves as a committee, and that tends to be just a few enthusiasts. But the run-of-the-mill of MPs, ministers, and so on just don't get enough input from the world of research. So, I mean, there's a lot of scope for trying to get these ideas, and also educating journalists of serious newspapers. The trouble is, there's so much in the way of populist mass media that we're always fighting a losing battle. And here, simplicity always wins out over complexity and subtlety.
Yeah. Seen from abroad, the role of this Home Office research unit, which is now unfortunately dismantled, as far as I know, was very, very important, and a lot of now academics started there. So, would you recommend this, or which is the risk of having the government put in some influence? I know that you were quite independent, although Leslie Wilkins always says that he was invited to leave because he said that if the law on drugs would change in the 60s, then prices of the drug would go up, would be multiplied by 3, and that is exactly what happened. And I think Time published that, or some magazine or newspaper did it. But I have the impression, and from what we discussed with also Pat Mayhew, that there was not a lot of political influence. Huh?
That's true, at least for a large part of the time that Home Office Research Unit and its successors ran. Occasionally the unit would publish something which was a bit embarrassing to ministers, and their attempts to soften the message a bit, but there were very few occasions when anything was completely blocked in my time there, which was about nearly 28 years, heaven help me. I mean, there's always attention, and occasionally when a certain group of ministers came in, for example, a Conservative government about 1990, just after Thatcher had gone, John Major came in, and the Home Office traditionally had a sort of centrist minister, whichever the political party. But John Major put a man called Michael Howard in, and he was considerably more right-wing. So although we had the same government, it felt like a change of administration. And he came in and infamously started saying prison works, when all the messages from research were that it had very limited impact, especially at the margin. It was quite tense at times trying to get some of the research publications out. I remember one occasion they actually put one of the administrators embedded in the Home Office research team to kind of keep an eye on us, but I think he quickly went native and came very much on our level. But there's always a debate between whether it's worth being in-house as a research group and having the opportunity to get access to a lot of people and a lot of data and so on quite easily, but at the risk of not only having close surveillance of you and potential pressure, but the fact that outsiders wouldn't see you as independent, versus being on the outside as an independent, albeit NGO type organization, but having to shout much more loudly to influence the ministers and policymakers. I mean, in some countries that happened. You saw them delivering rather extreme messages, which almost bounced off the political people because they were put in such an unsubtle way. So it's very much a trade-off there. But now we have much more of a mixed market. where we have still some internal researchers, but also very strong external research organisations, although some of those are actually having to lose some of their very experienced staff because of the financial plight of some of our universities, which is being brought about by our current government's attempts to reduce the immigration figures. They're making it harder for students to come in, harder for students to bring their families with them, and so on. So that means that a lot of the funds that support British universities are being reduced. I'm hoping this will change if and when we get a new administration. But I've seen a number of close friends who are extremely able, actually losing their employment at the professor level, which is quite a dire situation to be in.
Wow. This is happening now.
Yes, unfortunately.
Okay. That's okay. I didn't know that. Perhaps, Paul, we could. That's quite shocking. Professors losing their positions, because it's very difficult to recycle a professor. Then.
Indeed.
Okay. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about your 5 Eyes framework.
Yeah.
Because this is quite interesting to see how you develop this, and maybe the listeners should know that you have a specific website for it, but they can learn more. But perhaps you can tell us how this happened.
Okay, well, if I just get the message in about the website. I started out with a website dedicated to 5 Eyes, but it's since last year been incorporated in a website with all my stuff on it, just called crimeframeworks.com. And you'll find a major section on 5 Eyes there. Right, well, 5 Eyes started off as a series of additions to the conjunction of criminal opportunity, which was about the causes of crime, where I brought together all these different projects on crime prevention and distilled it down to 11 causes of crime and 11 preventive principles meant to block those causes, which integrated all the situational crime prevention and offender-oriented approaches to crime at the criminal event level. I found I was adding on more and more bits and pieces, and knowledge of process and so on. At the time, we had what was then called the UK Crime Reduction College, and ministers started getting interested in developing crime prevention toolkits. And so there was, for a while, an interest in sort of frameworks and processes. The conventional process model for doing crime prevention at that point was SARA, from problem-oriented policing, which is scanning, analysis, response, and assessment. I was finding there was a lot more process knowledge than that framework could handle. And I sort of started teaching it in a fairly loose way at the Crime Reduction College and various ad hoc lectures that I would give. I also then got involved with the Council of Europe, who had a big project which lasted several years on partnership in crime prevention, round about the late 90s. It was a joint effort from quite a wide number of member states, very interesting. approach and developing guidance for partnership. And that led to a follow-on Council of Europe project on trying to get crime prevention as we know it, or modern crime prevention, into Ukraine in its post-Soviet phase. So we all went off to Lviv and worked with the local police and other agencies to try and develop crime prevention scheme for them. Now, one of the ways, I think the Council of Europe were expecting some very, very specific recommendations, like, this organisation within Ukraine should be responsible for doing these crime prevention activities, and the police should be doing that, and so on. We, as a team, we thought this doesn't really work because Ukraine at that time was in, a really big process of institutional change, still coming out of the Soviet era and beginning to shape its own future. I mean, this all looks rather innocent and optimistic given what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, but against Ukraine. We thought it makes no sense to spell out exactly which institution should do which crime prevention tasks and roles, because they're all changing, they'll continue to change in the future. So we concentrated instead on spelling out systematically all the different tasks that professional crime prevention people have to do. And then we said, okay, these are the tasks. Now it's up to you, Ukraine, to work out which institutions and organizations will be best placed to undertake these tasks. So shortly after that, we had this great long list of tasks which had come out of all our knowledge, but built around some of the frameworks that I was beginning to develop in the Home Office. Then the European Crime Prevention Network was born. It was around about 2003. And they held, under the Danish presidency, they held a conference on best practice and crime prevention in Aalborg, in Denmark. And the Danish presidency, Danish Crime Prevention Council, invited me to try and develop a framework whereby all the member states could describe their crime prevention projects in a fairly systematic way. So I brought all my thinking together, and basically that's how the 5 Eyes developed. Five Eyes is both it's a process model for doing crime prevention, but at the same time, it's a framework for organizing knowledge of practice along the lines of that process. So it starts out, originally it was built on something like the SARA process, but I wanted to go into a lot more detail, a lot more depth, and make it really flexible, so that it could handle this immense variety of crime prevention, to handle the messy complexity of real life action. So my particular target, I think, was the response stage of SARA. You response meaning what you actually do to make the crime prevention happen. And I thought this is really far too amorphous. They're just having one heading for all the different things that you have to do. So I divided up response into intervention, implementation, and involvement. Intervention goes back to those causal mechanisms. How do you interrupt the causes of criminal events so that they're less likely to happen and less harmful if they do happen? So that's intervention. Implementation, the practicalities of delivering those interventions on the ground. You know, even things like target setting, finance, recruitment, that sort of thing. And involvement is the people side, people and organisation side of implementation. So, for example, you might have an intervention which is based in lessons on empathy or something like that, or anti-violence lessons in a school. So the mechanism of the intervention is to change the understanding and motivation of young people and increase their empathy so that they're less likely to be violent. That's the intervention. Implementation is how do you practically get the material out to schools? How do you put it together in a package that is understandable and teachable and so on? And involvement is then, you know, how do you get the teachers and the schools and the school governors and so on side so that they will understand this is the right thing to do? How do you motivate them? How do you give them the skills to do it, and so on? So basically, you're involving the school people in implementing the intervention. So each one of these is what I call a task stream. It's a broad stream of activities, and then there are two more task streams to add, hence the 5 I's. So we start out with intelligence, which is, you know, identifying what the crime problem is, what the causes are, who the offenders are, what the contexts are, and so on, which is equivalent to scanning and analysis in the SARA model. Then you get the intervention, then you get implementation and involvement, and then finally you get impact and process evaluation. And each of these top-level task streams, it's not directly a sequence, they're kind of conducted in parallel. So, I mean, for example, you can, if you want to involve certain agencies in crime prevention, you need to undertake particular kinds of intelligence to see which agencies are the most suitable to take on the responsibility and what their objections might be, what their anxieties are, and so on. So it's intelligence for involvement. On the other hand, you might want to do involvement for intelligence. So if you're working with, say, a private security agency, company or something like that, or a hospital, and you want to get their data on violent assaults, you have to develop trust. You have to mobilize them in some way, or get into a partnership with them in order to start the intelligence flow, make it acceptable to all stakeholders. So that's what I mean when it's not a linear process. Each of the task streams has a load of subsidiary tasks. So involvement, for example, will have things like partnership, climate setting, which is what I was talking about just now, getting the people and agencies who might be involved in the crime prevention activity to understand it, to see that it's acceptable, to participate in designing it so that they're happy with it, and they can feed their ideas into it rather than having it imposed upon them from outside, and so on. So partnership, climate setting, and mobilisation. So mobilisation is a key task. Whereas partnership is a sort of symmetrical relationship between different organisations, like the police, probation, youth service, local government. Mobilisation is more asymmetrical, where, say, local government or the police are trying to get individuals or organisations to join in and help out on more specific tasks. So I developed a subsidiary framework, sort of methodology under the mobilisation task, which goes by the acronym of CLAIMED. Clarify the crime reduction task, role or responsibility that you want somebody to undertake, and individuals or organisations. Then look around the community and locate the most appropriate individuals and organisations. Have they got the right knowledge? Have they got the right motivation and work responsibilities? Or have they got the time? Or have they got enough feet on the ground? Then once you've located the right people or organisations, alert them to the fact that there's a problem, a crime problem, and that it might be that they can do something to help prevent it. Motivate them. This could be, doing the right thing as a citizen. It could be, boost your corporate responsibility, reputation. It could be, on the other side, it could be naming and shaming. It could be financial incentives. Anyway, a menu of motivation. So alert, motivate, empower them. So, for example, you tell people, okay, this is how bicycle thieves operate. So if you leave your bicycle chain hanging down near the ground, then they could come along with a hammer and a chisel and bash it against the ground and break it open. And we have, we can show movies of people, thieves, doing that. So empower them by knowledge, empower them, perhaps give them special powers in some cases, in extreme cases of arrest or knowledge of the law or something like that. It may be appropriate to direct them. That's the D of claim. So if you give people funds, public funds for doing crime prevention, then we'll say, right, you've agreed upon this type of intervention. We don't want you to drift. We want you to follow these evidence-based mechanisms. We want you to give account. Or if you're patrolling the streets in an informal way, you can do it this way, but you mustn't be a vigilante. You must follow certain standards and so on. So that's clarify, locate, alert, motivate, alert, inform, motivate, empower, and direct. So zooming back out to Five Eyes, under all these headings, we can capture an awful lot of detail, and it's that practical detail that people need if they're going to share knowledge of how to prevent crime. I and a colleague from the Home Office went down to a police force on the south coast of England because we've been told there's a really good team who'd come up with a lot of preventive action by themselves against underage drinking. So we went down and we took about 3 hours using the Five Eyes as a rough interview schedule in a quite a light and informal way, taking them through the actions that they'd done and why, how are these actions intended to work, what are the practicalities of implementation, who do they involve, and so on. At the end of the 3 hours, we turned to them and said, do you realise that you have actually developed and implemented 13 different interventions? You've used lots of different methods of implementation. You've involved about a dozen different agencies and so on. And they were absolutely surprised themselves. Did we do all that? And if they didn't know and weren't able to articulate it, then neither did their managers know. And nobody else could share this knowledge. If you collect all that information and then you go on to do a process evaluation of each of the steps, it's a ready-made formula for process evaluation as well. Did each of those tasks get done properly? If not, why not? Why did they fail? How did they succeed? You've got a ready-made framework for process and impact evaluation. This is obviously done in parallel with, where appropriate, with rigorous impact/outcome evaluation, which by and large has to be done professionally, at least with a professional input in order to get reasonable rigor. But it's a way of assembling, capturing, organizing knowledge. And when you put a number of projects together in a synthesis, you can say, oh, look, this method of mobilization worked brilliantly here in this context, but it doesn't work in that kind of context. So if you synthesize that, then you can give so much more guidance to people trying to intelligently select and replicate action for their local problem and their local context. So that's kind of a rough tour of 5 Eyes.
Yeah. Can I ask you a favor? You have put all this knowledge, which is a practical knowledge based on experience, that works, and that we know it works. All this is on this website compiled, but it's available only in English. And of course, I know English is the common language, but it's the common language in some sectors. We are communicating all day like this, but what I see, especially now that I am in South America for a few months, is people are, they know how to read English, but they cannot follow sometimes all the time. And the artificial intelligence nowadays can translate things in a very powerful way, in a way that you would, of course, need someone, a native speaker, to go through. But that would be, in my opinion, a huge thing, because this is practical things. It's not an only academic. No, it's the theoretical and practical. And if this could be made available, I think that would be a huge contribution.
Yes. Both my sons started out as linguists, although they're both now lawyers, so they won't have time to do this, but certainly using artificial intelligence. It was actually very funny because one of my sons did an internship when he was studying languages. He did an internship in the crime prevention office in the German state of Lower Saxony in Hanover. And one of the things they asked him to do was to translate one of my 5 Eyes documents into German. And he was rather annoyed about this because, it's all dad stuff. It was extremely funny. But obviously, I spent some time conversing with him over the best way of translating. And this was before ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence things and so on. But it was actually quite challenging then getting the right word. You have one sentence where there were about 3 of the words in the sentence were fairly technical. And when you looked up on an online university level dictionary, there were about 4 meanings of each word. So how to select the right one. But I'm very willing to give this a go using artificial intelligence. So I think obviously Spanish and French will be my first attempts, because I would have some ability to check that it was okay myself. But other languages, who knows?
But
but
thank you for
think
that.
about it. Yeah, because best is enemy of good. Huh?
Mm,
This I learned from Ernesto Savona. So yeah, maybe the
Yes.
first translation is not the best one, but this can be improved. And you mentioned the 25 techniques. Some of the books made by the Pope Office, they have been translated to Spanish, and you can find like 3 different translations of a few of them.
Yeah.
So this can be updated. You only need someone that knows a little bit the craft and can give a hand, because this could be useful. Think Spanish is 500 million people, and in countries where crime is a reality. If you see what's going on in El Salvador, in many places, this is a huge thing, and it could be a major contribution, I think, at least.
Mhm.
Right, thank you for that.
Okay.
I'm enthusiastic about that.
And we have to ask you one question before finishing, because it's one of our classic questions. You've been working with crime like maybe for 4 decades. Huh? So how crime has changed during your lifetime?
I mean, the obvious thing is the reduction in material crime, particularly in the last 30 years, as physical security has improved, often by design, and also the again, equally obviously, the rise in cyber crime and cyber security. I think the main issue with cyber security and cyber crime is threefold. First, it's extremely complicated and arcane. I've tried to get into the cyber world, and you actually, in order to be a decent practitioner, to do more than just make general advice, you have to know an awful lot of technicalities. Secondly, it scales up so that you can come up with one crime method, and with just a very little investment of effort, you can be trying to defraud people across the whole world. And thirdly, the time scale of evolution. Evolution is extremely rapid. So in the past, with physical material crimes, criminals would eventually learn how to break into a new lock on a car or something like that, and you'd have to redesign the locking system. But in the current state, particularly again with artificial intelligence being misused by offenders, you could get very, very rapid evolution and counter-evolution and counter-evolution of criminal methods. So it's an evolutionary accelerant, and we're into a whole new ball game.
This is a very interesting point you make. The fact that it spreads like a virus. So then you bring in the concept of evolution, but you have also brought in the concept of evolution within your framework. I would still like to know, as one of the last questions, how did you come up with evolution within the 5i framework? Because few people do this using an evolutionary framework in criminology.
Yeah, I've always been interested in biology. I sort of majored in biology at school, and I did a bit more at university. So I've had this sideline in natural history, David Attenborough, all that sort of thing. And round about the late 90s, there was a kind of crime reduction board that was run partly by Ken Pease, where he spent a short time. He he was a long-time advisor to the Home Office, but he spent a short time as a sort of temporary director of crime prevention research. And he and I shared this interest in evolution. I'd also developed an interest in design. And I was seeing how, you would get somebody design a security system or a security product, and then somebody else would find a way around it. You get a car, a make of car where it had central locking, which was an improvement on security. Unfortunately, in one case, the central locking system was run by little pipes with air pressure, which operated the locks. And then some thief came along and found that if you took a tennis ball and you cut a hole in the tennis ball, you put it over one of the door locks and gave it the thump, that would send a pulse of air and open all the locks. So they had to redesign the system. And this got me thinking, this and other examples, that this is really like a little evolutionary arms race between predators and prey, or between pests and pesticides, or antibiotics and bacteria. So I just started applying evolutionary approaches in a more formal way. I wrote this paper called Gearing Up Against Crime in 1997, which was about how a lot of security people treat crime and crime prevention as very static. It's the same crime problems, the same solutions, whereas in the short term, there isn't much of a problem with displacement, let's say, but in the longer run, offenders are learning how to get around security, and security is having to catch up. So we need a completely new strategy. We need to build the capacity to out-innovate adaptive offenders against the background of changing technologies and finance models and business models and so on, which sometimes give the advantage to offenders, sometimes will give the advantage to security. So that's how I came to think about evolutionary processes, or co-evolutionary processes. And I thought maybe I can draw on my knowledge of natural history and start to come up with some examples, sort of biomimetics fashion, of security from the natural world. So one example is lizards, which if a bird attacks a lizard, the lizard's tail will drop off and the bird will be left holding the lizard's tail while the lizard escapes and lives. And then I thought, oh, that's maybe that's a new crime prevention principle. But then I found that police officers, when they wear a tie, their tie is detachable so that criminals can't strangle them. So that's being done. Then another example was shoals of fish, where you get fish gathering in their hundreds and all moving together so that it confuses predators and they find it difficult to select an individual fish. And then I saw an article about Saddam Hussein and how he went around in a fleet of identical armoured cars, so nobody knew which was his. So I realised at that point that humans have actually recapitulated on, reinvented a lot of ideas in nature. So I'm probably not going to get many ideas there, but what I can get is generic principles. So evolutionary principles such as building in variety into your preventive methods. So for example, if a local government housing department has social housing, and for reasons of economy and easiness of fitting locks, they fit the same lock on all the houses. And maybe the lock's quite secure for a while, but if you eventually some burglar will find how to crack the lock, or the locks will start to wear out and they'll become more vulnerable. So once the thief has learned to crack one lock, he's cracked them all. So it's a bit like a crop plant like wheat or potatoes or something. If you have a crop monoculture where they're all the same breed of crop, then a fungus comes along, has a mutation, and it can suddenly attack that crop, then it all goes. Whereas if you have a variety, it's far more resilient to attack. So variety is important in crime prevention designs. And for that, you need to think about how you set your crime prevention standards. So if you're designing a safe or a lock or something like that, you don't give a fixed standard, like all locks have to be made of manganese steel, 2 centimeters thick or something like that. You have to give a performance standard. Say all locks have to withstand for 20 minutes an attack by currently available tools that the thieves can use. And that standard is kind of future-proofed. So variety, future-proofing, maybe you also have some more preventive interventions in the pipeline. So for example, a satellite TV company or streaming pay site, at some point some math student somewhere might crack the code and then broadcast it to all his friends and so on. Well, the streaming company should already, to protect its business model, have a whole different set of codes in the background ready to broadcast and deploy, so that it's quick to overcome the problem. So there are about 7 or 8 different strategies you can use at a generic level to make your security future-proof. So that's the kind of approach that I recommend to handle adaptive offenders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also thinking about differential selective pressures, for example, how changes may affect future selective pressures on different kinds of offenders or different modalities of offending. Yeah. Very, very interesting, and unfortunately, too few criminologists think this way, I think. So it's a very important contribution to, to make people think evolutionary, because everything is dynamic. So that's what I think is a very important issue, which enriches the framework you use.
What it means is that we will never run out of a job.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. No, but Paul, it's really huge work that you have accomplished, and I insist on that issue of the divulgation in other languages, because otherwise the things that are translated are heavily influenced by the affinities of the translators, and so you get a lot of translations of some types of criminology without entering into the details, and others do not appear at all. It's not randomly distributed. It's completely oriented, and this has a consequence on how people, how the new generations are being taught. So there is, I think, something concrete to be done here, because it's saving lives. It's not a minor issue. I like your comparison at the beginning with medical science. It's a very good comparison, I think. At least that's what I think. I don't know if you want to tell us something that we did not ask, something that is important for you, and that perhaps we did not discuss today. We discussed a little bit about how, maybe we didn't talk a lot about how this is being taught. Where can people get this knowledge? How is this incorporated in the programs? because there is not a general program of criminology. There's no common set of branches.
Well, I think increasingly having material online overcomes those institutional limitations. So that's where I'm putting my effort now. And I mean, I think there are various European masters in crime prevention and so on, which are online. I'm not sure how far they've got, but I would suggest that's an approach. I suppose the other thing, in a rather biased way, I'm sort of observing the gradual spread of the crime science approach into a wider range of universities and institutions. I wouldn't want it to displace the wider criminological approach, which is equally important, and the two can stimulate one another. But I would welcome the extension of crime science into a range of other countries. I know that from UCL, Professor Spencer Cheney has set up a unit for teaching crime science in Latin America, which is a very welcome development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have the impression that lots of aspects of crime science are also incorporated in general courses in criminology, on crime prevention, for example. I know that I and some of my colleagues have courses on situational crime prevention within the regular criminology program, so it's getting known much better now than, let's say, 15 years ago. So there really is progress and integration, but of course it still can be improved.
Yeah, at least keep the diversity in that these kind of things are taught, because at least that, you know, that that people can hear both bells, you know.
Yes.
This is as I got my first degree in Argentina. I was surprised when I went to do the master and the PhD then in Switzerland by things that I have never seen. I never heard about situational crime prevention until 1992, you know, and I was already 26 by then. and I had a full career in law with some criminology inside the criminal law, but nothing. So that at least to keep this diversity. But as you said, if you put these things online, then finally the message arrives, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we did the tour of what we wanted to talk. I don't know, Lieven, something is missing.
I don't think things are missing. On the contrary, I would say we've had a very in-depth conversation on all the different aspects of crime science and 5i and the theoretical models behind it. So thank you very much for an extremely interesting conversation.
Yes, I greatly enjoyed speaking to you both.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you very much.
And let's keep in touch. And I will try to if you do this in Spanish, just let me know, because I have a good network in Latin America, and I think these are things that must be known.
Excellent. Look forward to that.
Thank you very much.
Then.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Guyot. Your hosts are Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Evi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.